Have you ever heard of a war started by a soccer game? It sounds like something out of a movie, but in 1969, it became a brutal reality. This is the story of the Football War, also known as the 100-Hour War, a conflict that erupted between two Central American neighbors, El Salvador and Honduras. And while a soccer match lit the fuse, the real causes were much deeper and had been simmering for decades. To understand this conflict, we need to go back in time. El Salvador, the smallest country in Central America, was also the most densely populated. For years, its economy was dominated by a wealthy elite, leaving little land and few opportunities for the vast majority of its people. This intense pressure pushed hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans to seek a better life elsewhere. Many found it just across the border in neighboring Honduras. Honduras was much larger than El Salvador, but had a smaller population. For a long time, the border between the two nations was relatively open. Salvadoran migrants crossed over, settled on unused land, and became a vital part of the Honduran economy, especially in agriculture. By the late 1960s, over 300,000 Salvadorans were living in Honduras, making up nearly 20% of the rural population in some areas. They were hardworking and integrated into their communities, but their presence was about to become a major political issue. The problem was that Honduras was also facing its own economic and political turmoil. The country was ruled by a military government, and a small group of wealthy landowners controlled most of the land, just like in El Salvador. To distract from their own failings and prevent social unrest among their own landless peasants, the Honduran government and landowners needed a scapegoat. And the Salvadoran immigrants were the perfect target. A nationalistic propaganda campaign began to sweep through Honduras. The media, controlled by the ruling elite, started portraying the Salvadoran immigrants not as neighbors and workers, but as illegal squatters, thieves, and a threat to the nation. This was a classic case of diverting public anger. Instead of demanding land reform from their own government, Honduran peasants were encouraged to direct their frustration towards the Salvadoran settlers. Tensions escalated dramatically. In 1969, Honduras passed a new land reform law. On paper, it sounded progressive, promising to redistribute land to native-born Hondurans. But in practice, it was a tool for dispossession. The law effectively stripped Salvadoran farmers of the land they had worked for generations. Thousands of Salvadoran families were forcibly evicted, their homes and livelihoods destroyed. They were given an impossible choice: leave the country or face persecution. A massive wave of refugees began flowing back into El Salvador, creating a humanitarian crisis. Imagine the scene: tens of thousands of desperate people, many of whom had never even lived in El Salvador, arriving with nothing but the clothes on their backs. El Salvador's government was completely overwhelmed. The economy, already fragile, couldn't absorb this sudden influx of people. The government saw the actions of Honduras not just as a humanitarian issue, but as a deliberate act of aggression designed to destabilize their country. The relationship between the two nations was at a breaking point, and this is where soccer enters the picture. In June 1969, the national teams of El Salvador and Honduras were scheduled to play a three-game playoff series to qualify for the 1970 FIFA World Cup. In this supercharged atmosphere of nationalism and resentment, these weren't just games, they were battles for national pride. The first game was held in the Honduran capital, Tegucigalpa. The night before the match, Honduran fans surrounded the hotel where the Salvadoran team was staying, making noise all night to disrupt their sleep. The tactic worked. A weary Salvadoran team lost the game 1-0 in the final minute. The loss was bitter, and the treatment of their team enraged the Salvadoran public. A week later, it was time for the second game, this time in San Salvador. The roles were reversed, but the hostility was even greater. The Honduran team was subjected to the same treatment, with crowds harassing them at their hotel. The stadium was a pressure cooker of nationalist fury. During the raising of the Honduran flag, the crowd jeered, and instead of their national anthem, they played a disrespectful song. El Salvador won the game decisively, 3-0. After the match, violence erupted. Honduran fans were attacked, and the escalating chaos was broadcast back home, further inflaming passions. Because each team had won a game, a third, decisive match was needed. It was scheduled for a neutral venue in Mexico City on June 27th. The tension was almost unbearable. Both nations felt their honor was on the line. El Salvador won this final, dramatic game 3-2 in extra time, securing their spot in the World Cup. For Salvadorans, it was a moment of incredible triumph. For Honduras, it was a national humiliation. The victory celebrations in El Salvador were intertwined with anti-Honduran sentiment. Meanwhile, reports of attacks on Salvadoran residents in Honduras intensified. The media on both sides fanned the flames, reporting exaggerated and often fabricated stories of atrocities. On the same day as the final match, El Salvador broke off all diplomatic ties with Honduras, citing the failure of the Honduran government to protect its citizens and punish those responsible for the violence. The path to war was now clear. On July 14, 1969, less than 3 weeks after that final soccer game, the Salvadoran military launched its attack. The Salvadoran Air Force bombed targets inside Honduras, and its army crossed the border. The so-called football war had begun. The fighting was fierce but short-lived. The Organization of American States, the OAS, scrambled to negotiate a ceasefire. After about 100 hours of combat, the fighting stopped. El Salvador agreed to withdraw its troops in early August. But the consequences of this short war were devastating and long-lasting. An estimated 3,000 people died, most of whom were civilians. Over 100,000 Salvadorans were permanently displaced from Honduras, putting immense strain on El Salvador's resources and contributing to the political instability that would eventually lead to the bloody Salvadoran Civil War a decade later. The border between the two countries was officially closed for over a decade, and trade was crippled, hurting both economies. So, did a soccer game really start a war? The answer is no. The soccer matches were simply the final, explosive spark that ignited a powder keg of pre-existing tensions, land disputes, demographic pressures, economic inequality, and nationalist propaganda. The war was a tragic outcome of governments manipulating their people and using nationalism to hide their own failures. It stands as a powerful reminder of how easily the passion of sports can be twisted and exploited for political ends, and how conflicts are rarely about what they seem on the surface. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more deep dives into fascinating historical events. Let me know in the comments what you think. See you in the next video.